You're listening to the Feral House Podcast, a semi-regular discussion of books with the authors who wrote them.
Hello, everyone. It's Christina, Feral House. I think we're going to call these Inside Feral House. I tend to take a few minutes and answer some questions about what we do and who we are and why we do it. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about is we get asked a lot of why a book isn't out when we said it was going to be out. So in the publishing industry, you have to essentially create the data about a book, and it's called the metadata, oftentimes 18 to 24 months in advance. And that's up to, we'll have the first draft, we'll have the book, and then the process starts, right? The process of copy editing and revisions, and then images and putting it together. And sometimes we discover some issues along the way, and we have to take care of them. And one of the things that was established by Adam early on was that the quality matters. It really still does to us. We don't want to put out books that are badly edited, though I've heard, commentary. But we want to put out books that are well designed, really good looking, something that will stand on your shelf and you're proud to read it and you're proud to have it. That's important to us. So we will always sacrifice a deadline for quality. So if a book is late, that's usually why. Sometimes of late, in recent years, we're talking about like 2024, 2025, is some of the chaos in the printing and transport industry has affected it. I've mentioned before that a lot of color books are printed in China, and sometimes it can take 4 months, 4 months for a book to get from the printer in China to the warehouse for distribution. 4 months, that's a long time. So again, if you see that your favorite book that you have, you want to get is not available yet, it's coming. It's coming, I promise. It's coming. So thank you again for your support always. And feel free always to ask a question. If you want to know something about Feral House, and if it's a good, fun question, we'll definitely answer it for you. All right, thanks again, and enjoy today's episode. Welcome back to the Feral House Podcast. And this is the place, of course, where we talk about Feral House and Feral House books and Feral House authors with the actual authors. With me today is Dr. Vincent Adejumo, who is the author of the upcoming book that we're so proud to publish, which is called The Return of Black Nationalism. And the subtitle kind of goes a little deeper, which is then that results the death of white supremacy. So Vincent is here to talk to me. We acquired the book, we're editing the book, and by the time you're hearing it, it should be out into the world and you'll be able to pick it up and read it. Hi, Vincent. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself first? What's your background?
Sure. So I am first identify as African American. I hail from Tampa, Florida, and grew up in a predominantly Black neighborhood, working class neighborhood. My parents divorced when I was 6, so I primarily lived with my mother, but also saw my father and his wife, my stepmom, pretty often. And all three, as well as my extended family, played a significant role in my upbringing and my understanding of the world as an African American man on this planet. So went to high school, Middleton High School, which I talk about in the book, is a predominantly African American high school at the time that I attended. And then I went on to Florida State University, predominantly white institution. And then from there, I worked in various cities for a for-profit college and university called Strayer University. So I worked in Atlanta, I worked in Augusta, Georgia, I worked in DC, District of Columbia, and also the great city of Philadelphia. Encountered a lot of people, a lot of thoughts, and a lot of ideas. And then from Philly, I made a decision to pursue my PhD. And so I went and was accepted into the University of Florida, where I majored in policy and administration in political science, and majored in policy and administration, pursuing my PhD, and which I acquired and which I earned. And then from there, was taught at the University of Florida from 2014 until 2025, spring 2025. And so since then have been doing a lot of entrepreneurial pursuits. I'm the president of the Olu Institute of Learning, where we specialize in after school programs for children in the greater Orlando area. And also, I own a construction business, and we also are launching, by the time this comes out, we are launching a ABA therapy center as well. So a number of entrepreneurial pursuits, been in industry, been in academia. I'm also a licensed teacher, K through 12. So I'm licensed in the state of Florida and Georgia, to teach K through 12 or 6th through 12th grade education, specifically social sciences. And so I'm just now published author.
I wanted to get a little bit into your background, because a lot of times when people will see a book on a topic like the political science and the history of American politics and the ugliness often of the chaos of American politics, and our natural instinct is to think, oh, it's just some academic. They don't have any lived experience. They don't live a life. They're just in their ivory tower. Well, one of the things with Vincent is no, he's a person just like the rest of us, who happens to be an expert on his lifelong study and the lived experience on the issues of Black nationalism. And so the entire book, to me, why I wanted to work with Vincent and why we wanted to pick up this book is, one, you guys know me already. I love the history. I love the history of these untold stories of American history. And in the book, Vincent goes through not just the politics, but that actual history of the experience of what it's, of being African American in the United States. So I wanted to ask Vincent, with your natural instinct to be a teacher, to share information, can you tell me a little bit more? I know what I saw in the manuscript when I first read it. What were you doing? Why did you want to write this book?
Well, I wanted to write the book because I actually started writing the book maybe 6 years ago. It was I was writing a chapter, one of the chapters in the book, actually for another book, but that fell through. It didn't go through, and so I started to read more and more, and I wanted to expound more and more on what I was writing. And so when I started kind of just putting everything together just from that one chapter, I thought to myself, I was like, I think this this actually could be a great book, something, to put forth, especially with everything that was going on. So around this time, when I started writing the book, Donald Trump was leaving office, and also we had COVID happen. So a lot of different things was going on in the world. And then so with that, you had a rise of a lot of different voices on the internet, specifically podcasters. So some of the things I agree with, some of the things I disagree with. And so I started, really putting that to paper as far as my thoughts. And then from there, I've already had the basic knowledge of the history of the United States as it pertains to racism and as it pertains to nationalism, but then starting to kind of build a sort of framework as far as how that applies today within the context of Black nationalism. And so with further reading, further studying, just started writing more and more, started paying attention more to the debate, the contemporary debates of the day, as far as especially as it pertains to African, lineage, African Americans and, just being Black in this country. If you're from a different country, so paying attention to those debates and then kind of fitting in the framework of Black nationalism, how those different topics of discussion works in today's world from a Black nationalist perspective. And then so from there, I would say about maybe 3 years into writing it, I started pitching it to different people, and people say, yeah, this would make a great manuscript. Some people thought academic manuscript, some people thought non-academic, but either way, I just started continuing to write the content, continue to study what was going on in the world. And then, the election happened, and then the election happened again. And so it all just kind of came together as far as the discourse, also too, in around 2019, 2020, you had Black Lives Matter become more prominent with George Floyd. So that made a significant impact as far as the discourse that was out there surrounding African American people and what should be happening to move forward. I also put out some articles around that time as well. I published a few things as far as in peer-reviewed publications, and also in just general news. So, for example, the conversation, I published a few pieces in the conversation talking about African American leadership and dealing with specifically the problem of the wealth gap between African Americans and whites. And so again, just looking at obviously not only just the data, but the historical context of it, then I started to go back and just say, you know what? I think this would go great into a manuscript as well, to furthering my thoughts as far as everything. So
Yeah. And so the book itself, it's very much it's history, because you go through the African American experience on the North American continent, but very specifically that history, because Black nationalism itself is not, and historically has been a wide range of ideas with
right.
some overarching through lines, but some very specific differences. And you tell that story and you bring it all together then present it with ideas on how to re-embrace this idea of Black nationalism. Now, and so I want people to read the book, so I'm not going to tell you everything that's in it. But what I do want to open up for everyone today is this larger conversation, because one of the first things that I've heard in response from, people, not always the smartest people, is they hear the word Black nationalism, that they hear that phrase, and they go back to their particular understanding of it, which is not always correct. And white people will hear the phrase Black nationalism, and they think that means they then will be treated the way that white people have treated African American people forever. Can you speak to that just core fear of white people, and what you mean, and what does it mean modern day to be a Black nationalist?
Right. Thank you. So, and it's interesting that you bring up that point, because not only when I told people that, hey, I'm writing this book on Black nationalism, not only have I heard that type of feedback from white people, but I've also heard it from Black people who are not from America. I've also heard it from Black people who are from more so the civil rights generation as well. And so the general critique from white people, as you said, is that, Black nationalism, they think of, some of the things that they think of violence. That's the first thing they think of. They think of, like we've had a couple of years ago, we had the Black gentleman who went out and shot police officers, or they think about some of the violent rhetoric that you hear from the new Black Panther Party or something like that, where it's just straight violence upon white people. Obviously that's not my context, my framework for Black nationalism, and I say that explicitly in the book. And then from the civil rights generation of African Americans, the critique I hear is that, we're all God's people, and we shouldn't be talking about separation. So again, I hear that critique from them. And then also the critique I hear from Black people who may be from other countries and or continents is that, they also, they come at it from the perspective of, in their country, they are majority Black, in their country. So they don't see why this issue of Black, basically Black people uniting in America to correct, the different things I talk about in the book, like the wealth gap, resources, that type of thing, building up and becoming sort of a nation within a nation. They don't see the point of that because a lot of them come over with the mentality to quote unquote enjoy what America has to offer, and so for them, they don't necessarily see Black nationalism just on face value. Now, when I explain it, all three of these groups, is different. They start to, see where I'm talking about. But just on face value, when they hear the term Black nationalism, there's a,
Sure.
and
Yeah, that the white people have the pucker. And that's what I talk about of just like, and so I want to really make that clear is when we think about, that there's a broad spectrum of beliefs and political beliefs. I mean,
right,
white people, brown, everybody is not in lockstep in their
right,
political beliefs or personal beliefs. And so I think that this is why, to me, the book is so fascinating and important because it's a very much a distilled modern day version of an activist Black nationalism of like, what do we do to move our society forward? So I want to go through a little bit, just a couple points of history, just to kind of bring people up to date of where we are, especially as we record this in spring of 2025 with the new Trump regime. There's some serious attacks on our notions of citizenship, of
yeah.
who has citizenship and who is an American. Vincent, can you tell us a little bit about the history of this notion of deciding both humanity and citizenship in the U.S., especially as it pertains to African Americans?
Yes. So from the founding of this country, there always have been debate and actual policies and law to define, at that point when African Americans, when we originated in Africa and was transported over to this country by force. And so there always was this notion, okay, are they people? Are they objects? And so obviously with the Constitution, they settled on 3/5 a person, which is, basically opposite, and
Mhm.
so, and even with the Supreme Court ruling in the late 1850s, and this is partly what started off the Civil War, that if a person was enslaved before and then they became, if they were enslaved, they couldn't sue for their freedom, right? They couldn't file a lawsuit for their freedom, or if they were enslaved and then they became free, they still can't. Certain states interpreted that they couldn't file a lawsuit against white people, because they still didn't recognize them for their humanity, and much less as being a citizen.
Mhm.
Some people say second class citizenship, but I reject that notion, because what exactly is second class citizenship? If you can't vote, if you are restricted in your movement, okay, just because you're not enslaved, I mean, to me, if you're not a citizen, you're not a citizen. So, I've had disagreements with scholars who would even use that notion as second class citizenship. To me, it's either you're a citizen or you're not.
Right.
And so America, has always defined, from the founding of this country, especially up until the 1960s, what not only just uh, the political rights or non-rights of Black people in this country, African Americans Black people who descend from the plantation, but also societal norms have defined what that is. So obviously, Jim Crow laws, and so people tie Jim Crow laws to the South, but we also have to recognize the your racism that was practiced in the North, and the race and the West as well. And so Black people African Americans were very limited in their movement in those places as well, where, maybe slavery was banned, even if it was banned, and even if, there may have been some loopholes for Black people to vote. At the end of the day, they still were not able to vote because of societal norms. So, uh, so again, to get back to your question, the point is that the United States, whether it's the federal government, state governments, or local municipalities, have always put in place laws, and not only laws, but society at large has always had norms to define and restrict the upliftment, the progress. Even if some people may say it is progress. So, for example, literacy rates from enslavement to 1900, you see stats that say, oh, it tripled. Well, obviously, naturally, it would triple, but still, who did that serve at the end of the day? Did that serve the African American as far as equalizing the wealth gap between themselves and their former masters? Or did that benefit their former masters who are now their employers? Because being able to read and write now that helps them push out more of their product that they're trying to sell. So these
Mhm.
are the things that I go over in the book. When people say progress, and then I question, well, what is progress? People say, oh, well, this demographic of African Americans are the most educated in this country. Okay, so what is the result of that from a financial perspective? What is the result of this so-called rise in education? When at the end of the day, we're still at the bottom as far as economically, and also as it pertains to political capital, um, and also at every, in the K through 12 level, you look at the different test scores still lagging behind. So again, I always question, so what is the result? So that's the thing from when writing from a Black nationalist perspective. I always have to question, okay, but what is the result, the long-term result of what we term or what is termed as progress?
That's an interesting point to say. And I'm listening and processing. That's a real fascinating point. This idea of we can call it equal, we can call it, and everybody's, progressing along. But yet, at the end of the day, if all of this education and quote unquote opportunity doesn't actually result in a personal successes, community successes for people,
Mhm.
it's all for naught. It leads me to a question. There's like, especially a lot of people are talking today, Project 2025. Nancy MacLean in 2018 wrote this fantastic book called Democracy in Chains, which was really this proto-history of the neo-Confederate movement out of James Buchanan from James Mason University. And this notion that this kind of pristine ideal of states' rights is really about forming a neo-Confederate state where there is just essentially large, wealthy oligarchy type owners, and then everyone else is a worker, i.e., specifically, mostly, African Americans, immigrants, and brown people. So, to that end, I find it fascinating in these ideas about nationalism doesn't necessarily mean separatism, but it does mean something about advocacy and self-advocacy. I'm going to give you one fact, because as most everybody listens and knows, I'm from Wisconsin. Is Wisconsin has this weird statistic that is just heads and above the rest of the United States, and it's a horrible statistic, which means 25% of our adult African American male population has been incarcerated at some time of their life. And as many people don't understand is, depending on the laws of the state, and very few of them are changing, is if you have a criminal record, if you've been incarcerated, you've been you've got a felony on your record, you lose your voting rights. And so you've been silent. So when we talk about voting, get out the vote, you have to just vote and the vote works out. Can you talk to a little bit, Vincent, about some of the modern ways that the systemic racism and the systemic prejudice against African Americans, how it's played out? Not, how is this happening? What are these things that these entities or people are doing to suppress African Americans?
Well, we can start, as you mentioned, Project 2025, and we can start with what just happened with the president, Trump, issuing the executive order to eliminate the Department of Education. And so a lot of people say, well, education has been going down in this country since the Department of Education was created in 1979. And I would agree with that, but at the same token, if you look at what the Department of Education actually does, especially as it pertains to, people say civil rights, but really the rights of Black African American students in our public schools is very vital, especially when it comes to enforcing different IEP plans and students who may be disabled. So those type of issues, the Department of Education comes and makes sure that schools and school districts are following federal guidelines for those type of things. And so, as you said, so now with the dismantling, even if Congress, because Congress really technically is the only people that can get rid of the department. So even if the Congress doesn't vote to get rid of it, what President Trump has done, he's reduced the staff by 50% at this point. He's taken away he's retracted certain guidelines that were in place to ensure that the civil rights laws were enforced, especially, you're talking about Brown versus Board of Education and some of these other um, laws that came about because of the Department of Education, or enforced by the Department of Education. So now with the dismantling of that, with the restriction of that, where does that leave our Black African American students? And so some, may say, well, the solution would be that, well, maybe we should have our own schools and our own, and our own network of schools. And I would agree with that, but that takes capital. And so if you don't have the capital, if you don't have the, the funding for that, it's very tough. I mean, having a schools are very hard to run, very hard to fund, especially what goes into it, especially at the state regulation level. So, so getting back to the point, with what the administration is doing when we're talking about systemic racism, so that's in that aspect. As far as in education, you think about in the financial piece, with them getting rid of a lot of the federal bureaucracy. A lot of African Americans are employed by the federal government, and so a lot of people have now been laid off, not only just in the federal government, but now you're talking about in the private sector as well. So that cuts off the ability to, if we're talking about trying to build our African Americans building their own institutions, well, it takes money. Well, you're cutting off that now with all of these different layoffs. And not only that, just the different barriers, as myself as an entrepreneur, understanding the different barriers to be an entrepreneur, to be successful. I mean, we're talking about the amount of property that you have to own, the amount of critique that you face from private banks, especially when you don't own any. African Americans do not have any national banks the size of like a Bank of America or something like that to loan to people. And so especially when you're talking about business loans. So it's harder to get a business loan for $250,000 than it is to rack up debt for college, So those type of things. We're talking about the financial barriers for African Americans to lessen the wealth gap between themselves and whites. That's part of systemic racism, And then we're talking about in the criminal justice system, socially speaking, with the different laws. So you hear with President Trump talking about new crime bills that he wants to sign, kind of building upon what Bill Clinton and Joseph Biden did in the 80s and 90s. Biden in the 80s, Bill Clinton in the 90s, and so kind of building upon that to continue the prison industrial complex. And so all of these different things encompass systemic racism. So there's a system in place to ensure that the African American serve the interests of white people. And so in serving that interest, then what happens is that you work so hard, you work 30, 40 years for your company to serve the interests of white-owned establishments, white-owned corporations, white-owned institutions, and so you don't really so you get paid just enough to sustain your lifestyle, but you don't get paid, to put something away, to save up, to create your own institutions and entities, and then employ your own people. And so that's part of the systemic racism. I just read a story. I haven't verified it yet, but where they talk about the current administration making $5 million or making gold cards available to immigrants, and they just have to pay $5 million and then they could come, they could come into this country on a certain type of visa, and then go from there. So we talk about that, then you have to start thinking about, okay, gentrification, and so how much now these people who come into this country, and this is not disparaging them, but this is just what has happened historically for decades and continues to happen. These people come here, and then they come, especially into the predominantly Black African American neighborhoods, where the property value may have gone down in recent years, especially if the property is by certain areas, by the downtowns or whatnot. So they buy up these places, they displace the African American Black people in those areas. And then from there, then the big, large corporations come calling, and then city government. So now they want to revitalize this area, displacing those African Americans who were there for decades. And so that's part of the systemic. So being moved from place to place to place, being uprooted, there's no stability there. And then we talk about the family structure, that's also part of the systemic racism. Again, when there's no stability, it's easier to ensure that the group remain dependent upon the system, and not having the chance to have some sovereignty, in a sense, to do for themselves.
I want to remind listeners of like one fact, just as Vincent was telling us this kind of just from different segments and what makes it systemic. I want to remind people what systemic means in this kind of context is I'm not talking about what I said or you believe. We're talking about institutional, governmental. A good example of that is if we think back to American large cities and post-World War II with the implementation of the freeway system, which was, Eisenhower modeled that on Hitler's autobahns, thought that's a great fast way to move an army, that's why those were built. Plus then you move commerce, and so to help corporations make even more money. But if you think about the major cities in the United States, those freeways purposefully went through predominantly African American neighborhoods, destroying both the kind of economic base of those neighborhoods and just the cohesiveness. It happened in Chicago. It happened in Milwaukee. Recently in Chicago, I mean, within the past 5 years, it's just insane. If you've ever heard, of course, famously, the South Side neighborhoods, the famous Maxwell Street markets, that whole neighborhood, which was a very vibrant, traditional, hundreds of years African American neighborhood, has essentially been absorbed by the University of Chicago and the University of Illinois. They've just essentially gentrified, torn down everything, and expanded their university. And this leads to then, where are people to go? So I want to point out that's an example of like the systemic stuff. And this is the stuff that is really harming our communities. And I want to talk about this. I'm shaking my fist here, is that this notion, I remember, I heard a great old activist quote of that you get this idea about public education, and you hear like, well, I don't have kids. I don't care. My kids are grown. But the best argument I've heard for a universal public education for everyone, and especially focused on, as Vincent, you were saying, is the kids who need the extra help. If you're, have a disability, an IEP, which signifies like some sort of a learning challenge, is ask yourself, do you really want to have stupid neighbors? This comes down to, it's our community. The better our education systems, it means that you don't have to be around so many dumb people. So, and so I want to talk about too, just again, coming back to this notion, a friend's daughter did some incredible research work about 10 years ago, and she's white, and really focused on racism and eliminating racism, both from systemic, but also that the small personal levels of racism, which again, I think that growing up in the United States, there's not a person, with the old joke, black, brown, white, or other, that would, has just notions based on how we grew up. And one of the most effective ways this research found is how to combat racism is by just hanging around people who aren't like you. And so can you speak to that? Just so this idea of, all right, we can battle the systemic racism. Black nationalism will help communities do that within. And so sell it for the white people. What's the benefit of Black nationalism for the larger United States and for white people?
The benefit of Black nationalism is that, first of all, stressing cultural pride in one's culture, right? So pride in one's culture, that's where everything stems from. If you don't have pride in your culture, you then do things just on a micro level that are destructive, And so when I think about different things, so for example, when I think about crime and the psychodynamics associated with crime, many scholars have critiqued the whole black on black crime thing because of, well, there's white on white crime. Well, obviously, and crime happens for the most part in proximity, in proximity. So crime happens within proximity of a person. So if it's by and large, America is still segregated by race. So black people live with black people, white people live with white people. So, but there are books out there that speak to the psychodynamics of crime, and that particularly when it pertains to the African American empire, and especially African American males. And so when you understand what your culture is and you have pride in your culture, then there's less of a propensity for you to do something against a person that looks like you. So if that's your brother, that's your brother. And that's one of the tenets of the cultural tenets of Black nationalism when we're talking about culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then when we talk about the economic piece to it, other demographics in this country. So when we talk about Latinos, or we're talking about the Asian community, and if you want to break them down by Koreans, by Chinese, Japanese, if you want to talk about the Jewish community. So these communities, they have a certain pride in their culture. They have a very, very much a significant pride in their heritage and how they identify themselves. And so from that identity and how they identify themselves, they're able to then branch off into the not only the educational pursuit, but also the economic pursuits as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so with Black nationalism, it's pretty much along those lines. So if you have a pride in your culture, and in your heritage and how you identify, then not only is that going to have a positive effect when it comes to certain things like crime and et cetera, but also when it comes to the economic building, of in proximity of where you're at. And so for the white people out there, that is something that I think that not only just white people, but all people can get behind, is that especially the African American taking pride in their culture and being able to build from that a economic base, a political base, and to ensure that the lowest in our community, in the African American community, are being supported. And so the more support that happens internally, then the less that the taxpayer has to worry about as far as that person falling in the wrong hands and now into the criminal industrial complex, and so that saves the taxpayer in the long run. And
Right. Yeah,
so
it's much cheaper to pay for education than for incarceration.
exactly. That's why I believe that everyone should be, even I may have some critique, there may be some critique within the greater Black community of Black nationalism. Again, they just kind of thinking about it from the optics and not really looking deeper into what it entails, and as far as building the nation within a nation model, for example, that Dr. Amos Wilson talks about. So
Yeah. So I see this, I see the benefits. One of the things that I'm going to, because you're an educator, you spend a large part of your career, and obviously writing a book is about trying to, you want to share the message and share an idea and a theory. It's education. So with that kind of that thinking is one of the things that people see in the media all the time, and let's think about the media and who owns it and to who benefits, is we're seeing this kind of scare tactics of like young African American men, and we saw it again in the 80s, we saw it in the 90s, we saw it in the 60s. This is a script that this follows, that somehow they're dangerous and they must be controlled in some way. It is it's really odd to see this same trope used over and over again. Yet at the same time, I've also seen and spoken, you talk to if you talk to young teenage Black men, is it's almost heartbreaking to hear just how no hope. There are a lot of young men, especially in poor communities and working class communities, they don't have any hope because they don't see a path forward for themselves, for a career, for an education. They don't see that normal pathway to, as everybody, the whole white, right? You're buying a house in the suburbs and you've got a car and the pool and the kids and all that stuff. Teenagers today don't have that same expectation, nor do they have those dreams. And when those dreams are taken away, um, you know, hey, in Milwaukee, we got the Kia boys. Might as well go steal a car. So again,
right,
these ideas are rooted in this, as you were saying, Vincent, of personal pride and identity of who we are. And I don't think I've never felt threatened by going to German Fest to go and eat a sausage and listen to the fun polka music. I've never felt threatened that somehow that Germanic culture was going to come absorb or overwhelm me or somehow erase my own experience of culture. So I'm going to ask the big question of when we talk about kids, especially, and kids in schools, is what are some of the really just basic ideas that anybody, if you've got a kid around you, I'm not even saying parent, if you've got a kid around you, what is one couple things that we can do to minimize and try to reduce it within our own personal, our family structures, as well as then, out in the world large, what should we be advocating for, especially in thinking about kids? I'm thinking about elections are coming up again, and the
right,
off years are usually when you start seeing school board elections and
right,
local municipal elections.
right. I think if you have children around, whether you're a parent or a caretaker, a teacher, someone who just interested in children, um, and no matter the race of the child, the identity of the child, I think first and foremost is being able to listen, being able to listen to them and then being able to communicate to them to what exactly is going on in the world, and having those frank conversations, obviously age appropriate. But so for example, a teenager, I think around the age of by the age of 14, 15, I think you should be being very frank with a child as far as the way that things work. And even so for example, I have two littles, I have two toddlers and a teenager. So with my littles, I try to, as far as the concept of race, at this point they're 2 and 3 years old. But, so for example, we were watching Miss Rachel, right? But then I started introducing them to Black creatives. So, for example, Miss Tab Brown, Miss Monica, some of these Miss Zoe, some of these African American women who aren't on the level of Miss Rachel. Miss Rachel has a Netflix show, but introducing them to other African American creatives and then having a conversation, hey, this is a Black woman. Oh, that's a Black woman, Daddy? Yes, that's a Black woman, And so introducing that concept to them. And then when it comes to my teenager, having very frank conversations with her because, she's a teenage girl, but she's growing into a young woman. And so emphasizing that you're a Black woman, so you're going to face not only racism, but sexism. And so, this is some reading that can help you with that. Now, obviously, I'm not giving her, college law level books to read, but I'm still just giving her books along the top, and I'm proud to say that my book is very age appropriate for teenagers. And thank you, Christina, for encouraging me to do that, especially with the pictures and whatnot. And so,
this is, I'm going to interrupt and just say, yes, I think that we're so thrilled with the book. This would be great. If you've got a 12 and up, and especially I'm saying, so 12, 13, a smart, active, that's otherwise, 15, 16, you have no problems, that you have nothing to worry about. But it also goes to, so you're doing the parenting and, and this idea of what we always say representation. And so
right,
when you see yourself, when you see people who look like you and have
right,
similar experiences, it helps us anchor who we are. And I say that as a working class person. And, it's not equivalency, but I've been in many situations where, I'm among the rich people and it's a little different. And you can't see class always, but, you can
right,
feel it. But that's the problem, I think, when we talk about this kind of the racism so pervasive in the United States based on skin tone, is because it is something that can't be hidden, or you can't code switch, you can't mask it. So I think that it's really important. It goes back to, I mentioned earlier, friend, the study of the more we spend time with people, people, just the more we get to know them as people. And that reduces just our overall prejudice against everyone. So I think it's a message to just get out and I know post-pandemic, get out in your neighborhoods, get out and talk to people. And definitely I'm, for this. I'm for reducing and eliminating racism in the United States. I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk about just a little bit about the book. Is you on the screen, by the time you guys see this, you're going to be seeing image of the book cover. Do you guys recognize the artist on the book cover? That's a picture of the United States and filled with portraits of really, classic, famous, and people who should be famous Black leaders in the United States who from Black nationalism. And that was done by Chuck D. And so Chuck did that as an original piece of art for Vincent's book. And so I bring that up specifically because we go back to, if you're Gen X like I am, Public Enemy was a really big influence for both African American young people and white young people as well, because it was great music. It was such a powerful message, and it was so anti-establishment that
right,
anybody, when you're fighting the power, you realize that there's oppressive natures to government structures in general, and everyone can fight back. So I'm looking to just share with everybody that you may think that this is not a book for you, but I'm telling you, this is a book that you should read because these are issues that we, as Americans, just we haven't dealt with very well. And I think Vincent's work gives us new insights as to different ways to be human and different ways to be American. As we finish up our hour, I can't believe we've been talking for about an hour, Vincent, is So I have to ask the questions. Of course, you mentioned earlier that you are, as the old activist is, you're putting in a kick in the praxis of not just writing about these ideas and talking about these ideas, but you're actually putting this into action. And you are working with your community and people and actually going and starting a school. Can you tell me just a little bit about what would be what would be different if we're going into your school, what would be different than say your standard, kind of think about your public school? What would kids see differently? What would a parent see that's a little different?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think the thing that would be different is those cultural signatories. My father is actually he's an artist, and so he's been doing art professionally since the 70s. And so I've always had an eye for art. And every time I look at one of his art pieces or any art piece, it makes me think of something different that I didn't catch before when I looked at it. And so in the case of my father, I looked at his art pieces 1,000 times, and 1,000 times I get something different. So for me, any institution that I would be a part of as far as the building of educational institution, you got to have art. You got to have the art, the stressing of the art. I believe is very important. I also believe in daily devotions that's centered in the African American tradition. Very important for that, for the spirituality of it, because I think a lot of what's missing in our public school system today, and even in certain private schools, again, I'm not saying religion, I'm saying the spirituality, the spiritualness, because, something to stress upon, not harming your brother or your sister, those different things that a lot of our institutions have to contend with the fighting and the disrespect, and nowadays with social media, somebody say something on social media, it gets around school, people want to fight. So stressing more of a spiritual connection, I believe, would be very important. As I say, so art, spiritual connection, and then also obviously the curriculum. I believe the curriculum. We have to stress not only history. It's great that if all of us become historians, but how does that solve the problem that we have today as far as the economic inequality, as far as the lack of political capitalism or political capital, the lack of economic capital. So all of those different things, because when I think of our traditional education system, again, we're being educated, African Americans are educated to serve the interests of white people and white-owned corporations. So now how do we reverse that and say, okay, how do we have an education curriculum and then later on system in which we are solving our interests? In which our interest is to solve our problems, not the problems of our oppressors, but to solve our particular problems. And so I think that's where the core of a curriculum would the mindset of a curriculum would come from as far as any school that I would be involved with in the creation of. So and
Yeah.
that's what I would want to do with what's to come for us.
Yeah. And so I think it's always fascinating to think about, if everybody thinks back to their own childhood, to their education, and it I my dad used to say something that was public schools weren't really about teaching you, reading and writing. It was teaching you how to get along with people
Right.
because because you're in a place with a lot of different people, and you really do have to figure this out. And I think that's one of the drawbacks when we see in this modern movement to this religious privatization of schools is
Right,
they become like these really isolated islands, and
right.
especially in these large white Christian mega
Yes, yes.
churches with their mega
Oh, yeah.
schools is I would challenge anyone who thinks that why, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, why is Feral House publishing a book on nationalism? Friends, go to one of those mega churches on a Sunday morning. Go visit, go hang out for the whole thing. And if you're not appalled at what they're talking about and what
Oh,
they're
yeah.
saying, then you are sleeping. You need to figure this out because
Right,
this is not good for anybody.
right,
Um,
right.
so when this is the kind of stuff. So I'm obvious where I stand on some of these issues, and which is of course why we published this book and why we're so proud to work with Vincent and work with these ideas. I want people to know that you will see Vincent on probably shows. You're going to hear him on different podcasts. You're going to read about this book because we are all in on this one. Um, if you are watching this, if you're listening to us, and if you are interested in learning more about Vincent's book, where to find it, it is, of course, available anywhere and everywhere because, again, Feral House has international distribution, so you can get it anywhere. And if you can't, just send us an email. You can always find out what's happening and where our authors are going to be, mostly in our newsletter. Please subscribe. Any questions, send us an email at info@feralhouse.com. And Vincent, any last thoughts, any last words you want to share with everyone?
Oh yeah, just definitely please if you can support the work. A lot of blood, sweat, tears, and years went into this publication. And I'm so happy to be a proud of the Fair House family, and I am looking forward to the impact that this book will have on our country.
Yeah, we want that too. We want people to kind of figure it out a little better. Come on, we can do better, people. Come on. All right. Thank you again. Thanks as always for listening to the Feral House podcast, and we'll see you and hear you next time.
Hey fiends, thanks for listening to the Feral House podcast. We do this about once a month, talking to Feral House and Process Media writers, as well as members of the extended Feral family. You're part of the family. Let us know if you have any questions or if you have an idea of someone we should talk to. You can send me a note at press@feralhouse.com, PRESS @feralhouse.com.